In early July of 1999, I was guiding a party of three when this accident occurred. But let's have a little background first. The standard routine for guiding the Grand is that we gather our clients together in the morning of the first day, and we depart from the parking lot in Lupin Meadows, which is at 6,000 feet elevation. And
It's okay. I'm just turning that off so I don't come up on the recording.
Okay. So we spend the next, depending on what condition the clients are in, 5 or 6 or 7 hours going from the Lupin Meadows parking lot up to the lower saddle. And there'll be a picture that you can see clearly where the lower saddle is in relation to the ridge line that goes up to the summit of the Grand. So we arrive there at anywhere between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, and people rest up a bit and have water, and then we gather in the hut, and the guides boil up water, and the clients have their bag of food, which we put in the boiling water. And then we have a briefing as to what's going to happen the next morning. A part of the briefing includes outfitting everybody with a harness and a helmet. Now, this particular day, one of my clients could not find a helmet that would fit her what she felt to be properly or comfortable. So I said, here, try mine. And wouldn't you know, my helmet fit perfectly. So I let her use my helmet, and I went without. Now, for many, many years, decades, the guides never wore helmets because on the Grand, usually we're on the Exum Ridge, and the guide is leading, and the route is configured so there's no danger of falling rocks or objects from above, because we're usually the first ones out. So this felt like a reasonable alternative. However, we got up at 3 in the morning, 3 or 4, and got ready to head out. And the weather was looking not so good. So there were 4 guides, including me, and 12 clients, and then the Exum Ridge. In fact, the Exum Ridge with clients would be difficult for descent. So we head out for the upper saddle, and we arrive there shortly around the time of first light. And we do the first pitch. I'm second in line, and we get up the first pitch, and then up to the second pitch. We go on up to the next pitch, which is the third pitch, and there's somebody out in front of me, and I get to the beginning of the third pitch, and I'm ready to belay my client up, and all of a sudden a rock about the size of a potato comes down and bounces off the rocks twice and hits me right square on top of the head. So my first instinct was to wrap the belay rope around my thigh, because there was a client on the other end, even though she hadn't started climbing yet. And then the next thing was to check for fingers and toes working. And, I did the primary survey on myself. And then I reached under my wool hat and felt a little damp. I pulled my hand out and there was blood. So I took a handkerchief and put that under the wool hat, making a compression bandage there. And then I said, on belay, and brought my client up. Enough time had gone by so that when she arrived, she said, "You got hit by that rock, didn't you?" And she scolded me and said, "You guides should wear helmets." Well, we continued up the route, got to the summit, got back down. It takes, it's a long day that second day. We try to get to the summit between 8 and 9 in the morning because we've got to go all the way back down to the parking lot. So we did that, and in a couple of days, I was okay, good to go again. But I had quite a laceration on the top of my head. Probably should have had stitches, but didn't. Um, in any case, that's the short story on that. Now, the point is, what's the takeaway? What are the lessons here? Well, the ultimate irony is that as the head of safety and risk management for the guide service, I started insisting right about this year that all guides would wear helmets. And there was great uh, uh, resentment to that. The guides said, we never wore helmets. We don't need to wear helmets. And I said, well, check this out, you guys. And uh, the next lesson is this could have been a lot worse. I'm very lucky that the injury, that I wasn't knocked unconscious, and two, that the injury didn't require more first aid. And so what would have happened had I been incapacitated? Well, there are 3 other guides, but it would have taken a while for everybody to figure out what had gone wrong. And then it would have changed the whole day. Might have involved um, the guides, 2 guides taking all the clients down to the lower saddle. Might have involved a helicopter, so forth and so on. So the consequences could have been a lot worse. And then the other thing that it brings up is, what should we teach our clients, our participants, whether it's a professional guided climb like this or Outward Bound, where I worked for many, many years? What should we teach our participants about first aid? And what should we teach them regarding protocols? Very important lesson as far as I'm concerned, because they need to know what happens in the what if scenarios, because these things can definitely happen. So our clients now, these many years later, there is a protocol for telling clients what to do in the event that a guide has some physical incapacity. And that's a very important thing to do. So I think with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. The second story takes place at North Carolina Outward Bound School in May of 1969. Many people confused Upward Bound and Outward Bound in the early years, in the 60s. Weren't sure which was which, and it's understandable. But it so happened this course was with a contract course with Upward Bound students from Wesleyan University. Now, Upward Bound kids were those who had been identified in the early high school years as having college potential, but were not living up to that potential. So the goal of Upward Bound is to have some motivational material for them early on in the summer, and then to engage in 4 weeks of academic work to try to bring them up to speed and encourage them to the point where they might even think about applying to go to college. So the director of Upward Bound had decided that what he and his staff were doing at Wesleyan for orientation just plain wasn't working. It wasn't motivating the kids. So they found Outward Bound and set up a contract with North Carolina Outward Bound. And I was among, I think, a dozen staff people when the 68 students and staff arrived from Middletown, Connecticut at North Carolina Table Rock Base. And you want to talk about a total change of environment for these kids. I mean, it was unbelievable. And frankly, most of the staff at North Carolina had never worked with these kinds of kids. My wife and I had, Carl Ronke had done so. I'd taught in an inner city school. So, and I wasn't locked into the outward bound model. On day 3, you do this, period. So it required a lot of flexibility on our part. And some staff rankled at that because they said, it's not outward bound. But the point is, these are 9th grade kids. There were some of us who said, most important thing is to get them comfortable with the environment before we start throwing challenges at them. My wife, Perry, realized right away that a simple thing like setting up a tarp, which required knowing how to tie a half hitch, was an hour-long process. But when the 2 gals she was working with achieved that, doing the half hitches, they couldn't have been prouder and happier. Well, okay, we had to slow the day down a bit, but that's the way it was. We did whole different approach. But these students were inner city, and so we had a building called the Phillips Building, which is where the mess hall was and a meeting area. And one day the students took that over, and we had to sit in there. And so I went in and said, well, it's time to hit the trail. And my patrol was in there well, Perry and I had a co-ed patrol, and they were in there. And one kid said, we ain't going anywhere. We're eating in the cafeteria. I said, well, there's only one problem with that. Lunch isn't going to be served here. I said, anybody here know how to read a map yet? And I knew a few of my kids did. So he said, yeah, I can read the map. And I said, okay, well, here's the map. And I show him the map. And I say, this X is on the map is where lunch is going to be today. And that's where I'll be. So see you there at noon. And by golly, they arrived at noon. I mean, it wasn't like it was some complicated 20-mile map and compass course, but they got there. And we had lunch and we continued on. So that's the way the course went along. And now comes the story. A couple of weeks into the course, we're going to do a solo. It'll be a shorter version, two nights, 3 days. So Perry and I set our students out, and they're in reasonable proximity, and we have the route fairly well ribboned so that if there's trouble, they can find us. And it's not too long after they're put out on solo that one of my students, Bill Jenkins, comes back, and he says, hey, there's a bear under my tarp. And I said, Phil, that couldn't possibly be, because remember we said no food? Now, the way we worked solo was with these kids was we didn't force them to fast for 3 days. We said, we'll bring food out to you. If you want it, fine. If you want to fast, fine. But don't bring any food under those tarps, because we've got critters here, from porcupines to bears. So Phil comes in and he says, there's a bear under my tarp. As I say, I said, it couldn't possibly be, knowing darn well that he probably brought something with him. So I walked back to his tarp with him, and there's a little bear underneath, a little black bear, a yearling. And so I start clapping. I could see that the bear was gnawing on probably what was a Weiler's lemonade package. So anyway, I clapped my hands and I said, now, Bruno, come on, you go along. You know you're not supposed to be here. And the bear lumbers off, and then turn around, and Phil's looking at me and he's shaking his head. He said, you know that bear. So anyway, I had to convince him that it was going to be okay to stay out on solo, and that he could come back to camp if there was another scare and so forth. And he did, and they all finished their 2-day solo. And all those kids who stayed, and by the way, a dozen or so kids left that course, went back home. But the ones who stayed had a good experience. But let's talk about a couple of the lessons from this. Well, for us, the lesson was meet the participants where they're at, not where you're at. So, I mean, it's true of every student you have. You have to start where they are in their own development. in Outward Bound, we're trying to move kids from dependence to independence. And in some cases, you can do it quickly. In other cases like this, you can't. So having them comfortable enough with this totally new place, we felt was, we weren't going to get anywhere unless that happened. And then the second thing was building trust, that even though Phil thought that the bear was my pet, I finally convinced him it wasn't. But the trust that I wasn't trying to pull a fast one on them, and that they could go ahead and stay out there and they'd be okay, and that they could get help if they needed it. And I think those were two big lessons. Some of our staff down there, and because of their orientation, didn't quite get that. But by the end of the course, which was 3 weeks, came along pretty well.